That phrase is very important. This is very important to humanists. It is very important to atheists. But there's more to this than we might be aware of, and we need to understand. The reason I'm putting these together is that if you're a Christian, you need to understand these philosophies are all designed to destroy Christianity. They're all designed to undermine the church, because once you reject that particular worldview, you must find another worldview. So they steal pieces of it, but because they don't have the truth, they reject the logos. They are built on a foundation of error. Their premises are flawed. So they've got some truth and they've got a lot of error. All the best lies have a little bit of truth. But also, there's something else you need to understand. So it's not just the rejection of Christianity and the church. There's also a worldview and a way of thinking that comes along with being a Christian. And this is the worldview that was ultimately developed by Saint Thomas Aquinas and the Scholastics in the Middle Ages. And these philosophers ultimately, especially within the Enlightenment, are rejecting that form of logic. They're rejecting rigorous logic. So understand, they're not only rejecting the church, they're rejecting logic. Logic comes from the logos. God is the logos. Logic. That word gives us logic. So understand, you are not only rejecting Jesus, you're not only rejecting God, you're not rejecting the church and Christianity only, you are also rejecting logic. You need to understand this. We need to look at the thinking that goes into these really insane ideologies. So the ancient Greeks were originally or generally considered pagans. Now, these here are pictures from the French Revolution. You'll notice those in the French Revolution, those leaders and enlightened thinkers of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, they thought of themselves as these pagan thinkers. They actually cast themselves in that light. In fact, they worshipped the cult of reason, and this was their goddess, right? They had the goddess here that they reasoned. So we've spoken about that in the French Revolution talks. So they stylized themselves as these ancient Greeks and Romans. And in fact, there's a very famous historian called Peter Gay who writes a very detailed historical appraisal of that period, and he called it the rise of the new paganism, because it is a rise of the new paganism. Paganism is a broad term used to describe non-Abrahamic religions, particularly those that were prevalent before the rise of Christianity. The ancient Greeks practiced a polytheistic religion. They worshipped various gods and goddesses such as Zeus, Athena, Apollo, and Aphrodite. So remember, they had a whole pantheon of gods. They had elaborate rituals. They had temples and festivals dedicated to their deities, which formed a significant part of their cultural and religious practices. Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, while they were influenced by these cultural and religious ideas that were present in their time, they made contributions to philosophy that went beyond the traditional pagan religious framework. Now, the Enlightenment, often deemed by atheists to be modern and scientific, as we've learned, the French Revolution, as an expression of this, was brutal, sadistic, psychopathic, inhumanly barbaric, and a precursor to what happened with, those guys in World War II, right? So they prefigured a lot of what happened there. So atheists love to think of it as modern and scientific, but as we know, when it was expressed within the French Revolution, this was a celebration of pagan culture. The French Revolution, the Enlightenment, was a revival of pagan culture. Yes, logos has many meanings. Yeah, it definitely has many, many meanings. Right, so let's see if modern science has a perspective that, while supposedly modern, has a pagan overtone. I thought I fixed all the typos. I see I have a typo here. I checked especially. The gods have had different names in different countries. Yes, for instance, Hermes was Mercury, right? So the Greek Hermes was the Roman Mercury. And of course, these gods made their way into other cultures through trade networks and so on. So you had Diana would be called Aphrodite maybe somewhere else. So you had these names, but the same god, roughly the same qualities across different cultures and times. Right, so let's talk about Carl. So Carl says here, how is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought. The universe is much bigger than our prophets said. It is grander, more subtle, and more elegant. I personally think Christians tend to look at the world as awesome and the universe as awesome. But he says, no, instead, these religious believers say, no, my God is a little God, a tiny God, and I want him to stay that way. He's probably never been to a church, but okay. A religion old or new that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. Now, here he's speaking of humanism, which is the scientific religion, the replacement of Christianity, specifically within the context that I've addressed it in the past, the replacement of the Catholic Church. And don't forget, socialism, which brings us to communism. Communism is meaning universal. What does Catholic mean? Universal. See the parallel? This is Carl Sagan in the pale blue dot, the vision of the human future in space. Now, universities began as religious institutions, which most people don't speak about, don't realize, don't know. Now, C.S. Lewis wrote, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator, which is odd because atheists and, of course, materialists believe in a random universe that has no order, no structure, randomness. How can you have law in a random universe? Now, the term laws of nature actually comes from Christian medieval thinking. The term laws of nature, because God is ordered. God is not pagan, doesn't conform to the pagan rules of just being random. He conforms to logic. So science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. I'll repeat that. Science can purify religion from error and superstition. Religion can purify science from idolatry and false absolutes. Each can draw the other into a wider world, a world in which both can flourish. This pagan statement is by Pope John Paul II. Actually, hold on, I'm looking. There's no paganism in that. That's actually quite a sensible statement. Now, I'm going to be using a fair number of quotes from Catholics, or I'm offering a Catholic perspective, for the simple reason that people annoy me when they speak about the Catholic Church as pagan, because, man, I've gone looking for the paganism. I haven't found it yet. I'm not sure how a crucifix is pagan. Maybe some intelligent Christian who says that can let me know exactly how a crucifix is pagan, so that I can then use that information to go and look it up and then prove how you're actually being an ass. But that's a slightly different off-topic topic. So what you've got within the Catholic Church is a synthesis of faith and reason. The two support each other. Communist Catechism. Yes, exactly. Yes, the Communist Confession of Faith. Exactly. That's the Communist Manifesto. Was the Communist Confession of Faith. Was the Communist Catechism correct? True science and true religion are twin sisters, and the separation of either from the other is sure to prove the death of both. Science prospers exactly in proportion as it is religious, and religion flourishes in exact proportion to the scientific depth and firmness of its basis. Thomas Henry Huxley. Now, we don't know for sure that he actually said this. This is quoted from the close of a recent lecture by Huxley in What Knowledge is of Most Worth? Lectures in Education by Herbert Spencer, delivered at the Royal Institution in 1855, published in the Westminster Review, July 1859, volume 22, collected in Essays on Education and Kindred Subject, 1911, page 41. That's the citation. Now, of course, Thomas Henry Huxley hated religion, hated Christianity. He was an avowed atheist. He was a huge supporter of Darwin, and he created the word, even though he was a rabid, toxic atheist who hated the church, he coined the term agnostic, because he called himself an agnostic, even though he himself was not an agnostic. But it was a convenient, shall we say, shield to hide behind. Now, why he said this, I don't know, because he says some completely opposite statements at other times. I've covered this in my Darwin series, where I covered Thomas Henry Huxley, and he says things that are very anti the church. Huxley also said, extinguished theologians lie about the cradle of every science, as the strangled snakes besides that of Hercules. Someone was mentioning Hercules earlier. So dead theologians lie about the cradle of every science, as the strangled snakes besides that of Hercules. So in other words, science has killed all of the priests. Science has killed religion. I don't know how these two statements actually, they contradict each other, but yeah. No one said atheism makes any sense. Pope Pius XII, in his encyclical Humani Generis, acknowledged the importance of taking positive sciences into account, particularly when dealing with clearly proved